Adam Hecht seemed to be living the life most people dream of. Growing up in luxury, the son of a famous film producer with a loving mother and 5 siblings to spend time with, he'd rub elbows with celebrities, attend good schools, wear nice clothes, and learn to drive in beautiful cars. For many people, that's the American dream, and yet for Adam, the glamour of it all was beginning to wear off. In his mid-20s, Adam had a successful business working as a tennis instructor, but the older he got, the more he seemed to question the nature of the environment in which he lived. In a search for meaning, Adam began volunteering at homeless shelters and missions. While it was hoped he would find himself in the pursuit of helping others, he may have instead lost who he had been. What had began with philanthropy slowly became something else. Adam would move a homeless man named Tony into his apartment. The more time Adam spent with Tony, the more he seemed to change, and soon Adam was spending nights out on the streets amongst the homeless. In June of 1989, Adam vanished, and when his family tried to track him down, all they found was Tony, living in Adam's apartment, apparently with no knowledge of his whereabouts. What happened to Adam Hecht? Did he fall under the charms of a homeless man who was manipulating him all along? Was he the victim of someone who wanted what he had, or did Adam, for reasons unknown, choose to walk away from his life and live amongst the homeless and become a part of their world? This is Trace Evidence, Episode 88, The Disappearance of Adam Hecht. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. I'd like to welcome any new listeners who are tuning in today. You may not recognize my voice, but I bet you've heard my words. Today, we'll be examining the mysterious disappearance of Adam Hecht. Before getting into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focusing on a different unsolved case each week. If you have questions, comments, or case suggestions, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at TraceEvPod, on Instagram at TraceEvidencePodcast, or join the Facebook discussion group simply by searching for Trace Evidence. You can visit the website at trace-evidence.com for full episodes, social media links, merchandise, and more. As a final note, Trace Evidence is a complete one-man operation, so if you'd like to help support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/traceevidence, where you can gain rewards such as stickers, pins, and other surprises. If Patreon isn't your thing, but you still want to pitch in, there is a PayPal donation button on the website. One final note before getting into the case. I wanted to wish a very happy birthday to Lisa Halliburton of Plano, Texas. Your sister reached out and asked me to send my best wishes, and it was just so sweet I couldn't say no. But now that I think about it, aren't you twins? Well, happy birthday to Lindsay, too. I know it was 2 days ago, but I hope you don't mind me being a little late. Today we examine the disappearance of Adam Hecht, a very bizarre case that's haunted me ever since I first learned about it back when I was a kid. There's not a lot of information available about this case, but the story is extremely compelling and disturbing. So without further ado, this is Episode 88, The Disappearance of Adam Hecht. Adam Arthur Hecht was born on August 6, 1985 to parents Harold and Martine. This was Harold's second marriage, and he and Martine would go on to have 3 children together, with Adam being the second to youngest of what would ultimately be 6 children, including the 3 from Harold's first marriage. Adam's father, Harold, was involved in the entertainment industry, working in Hollywood as a film producer, as well as operating for a time as a talent agent and theater producer. Harold had worked in Hollywood for years, left to return to New York, and later returned, finally breaking through and becoming successful. As a result of Harold's successful career, he would raise his family in Beverly Hills. As I'm sure you're already aware, Beverly Hills is a city in Southern California which is home to many celebrities, high-fashion boutiques, and other amenities. In the 2000s, census data showed that Beverly Hills had a wealthy population with a median household income of $102,000. According to friends and family, the Hechts were a close family, and Adam was especially close with his younger brother, Harold Hecht Jr. From a young age, it seemed, Adam was skilled when it came to sports, showing off great athletic ability which would become a defining factor in his formative years. One descriptor which comes up a lot when researching Adam is the word caring. Adam seemed to have a real investment in not only the lives of his family and friends, but also strangers and the less fortunate. Having grown up in the opulence of Beverly Hills, in the shadow of Hollywood, Adam had a very particular perspective on the world. And while many who were raised under these conditions may develop a sense of separation from general society, perhaps buying into the elite status of being part of a rich family, the kind of thing we've seen in a reality show or 50 in the past 20 years, but Adam seemed unaffected by it. Adam's parents separated and got divorced in 1974, a month or so after Adam had turned 9 years old. While divorce can certainly be hard on the children, from everything I can gather, the split wasn't exactly one filled with personal attacks or vengeful tactics, and the family stayed pretty close. Martine was awarded the home, half of Harold's assets, and a monthly alimony/child support payment of $4,000. While the divide likely caused some level of distress in Adam's life, it wasn't one which has ever been suggested to have set off any alarm bells in terms of his behavior or his response to the situation. All in all, Adam seems to have developed into a level-headed, independent young man who was driven, focused, and determined. Specific details about Adam's childhood aren't exactly available for public consumption in a wide variety of sources, but over the years, similar styles of conversation have been used to try and explain the world in which he lived. There's been a lot said about Adam, as well as his siblings, growing up in a sheltered environment. Perhaps living in Beverly Hills, attending Beverly Hills High School might not grant someone a fully accurate understanding of the world around them. We all grow up in our own little bubbles, and for many, they understand the world as they experience it. When you're living in the lap of luxury, driving nice cars, eating expensive meals, never having to really worry about if you're going to make it, it can be pretty easy to lose sight of what the vast majority of people are struggling with. That didn't happen to Adam. And if anything, his upbringing seemed to make him almost hyper-aware of the struggles of others, and this seemed to activate an innate desire in the young man to give back, to contribute, to help those he could. This wasn't necessarily always a part of Adam's personality, and while many have described him as driven and polite, it wouldn't be until his mid-20s that he would begin to really explore different avenues of life. Upon graduating from Beverly Hills High, Adam wasn't exactly sure how he wanted to spend the rest of his life. As many of us experience at that time in life, there are a lot of options, and you've got to find the one that speaks to you. Being a natural athlete, it only made sense for Adam to pursue a business that would make use of his physical skills. Adam began operating as a tennis instructor, and the combination of his family name and his exceptional abilities was enough to draw in a growing clientele. The business had been described by his family as successful, and Adam was doing well for himself. Unfortunately, in 1985, 3 months before Adam's 20th birthday, tragedy would strike when Adam's father Harold passed away after a battle with pancreatic cancer. Harold died just 6 days before his 78th birthday, and while not much has been publicized about the family during this time, it isn't difficult to imagine that a loss like that could have a major impact on you when you're trying to make that adjustment between teenager and adult. While we may never know exactly how Adam processed the loss of his father, there does seem to be some note given to the tight-knit nature of the family and the likelihood that during that troubling time, the siblings would have provided comfort and support for one another. In the years following Harold's passing, Adam lived in an apartment managing his business and was still heavily involved with his family, frequently attending functions and dinners. However, there seemed to be something inside of Adam that he was struggling with, and his family started to notice changes in his personality. 1988 started off fairly normal, but it would quickly become a year in which drastic changes would be noted, not only about Adam's personality, but his behaviors and the people he spent time with. Around this time in his life, Adam began taking a look at the environment in which he lived. While he'd always noted the disparity between his lifestyle and others who didn't grow up the way he did, the differences really seemed to be gnawing at him. It was as if in some way Adam was struggling to identify who he really was, and he was torn between the wealthy, preppy-styled business owner he had been and the guy who was interested in life on the other side of the tracks, so to speak. According to his family, who were interviewed for an episode of Unsolved Mysteries back in 1990, They saw the struggle but weren't exactly sure how to help. While it was apparent that Adam was trying to work through some things and maybe feel his way out in the world, that's the kind of thing you have to discover on your own. No one's going to be able to guide you to determining who you are and the type of life you want to lead. Of course, they were there for support and would do anything they could to assist Adam along the way, but it wasn't exactly the kind of thing you could get deeply concerned about. A lot of people entering their mid-20s start to wonder about the life they're leading and the life they want to be leading. In 1989, Adam would turn 24 years old. From the outset of the new year, things in Adam's life began shifting, and it was an encounter early on that would become the catalyst that changed everything. Perhaps it was in response to his search for meaning or for understanding of himself, but Adam made the choice to begin participating in community activities, which would afford him the ability to give something back. Adam began volunteering for a mission. There, Adam could work with the homeless and downtrodden in an attempt to improve their lives, even if only by providing a warm meal a few times a day. This was initially viewed as a good thing. Maybe Adam, by way of volunteering, would experience more of the world, get a more well-rounded education on the different sides of life, and perhaps best of all, it was a way for him to focus his energies and feel like he was contributing, that his life had value, and perhaps that the answers he had been seeking about himself he could find in his desires to help others. Unfortunately, this would be the first step which would lead him into a world from which Adam could not escape. It began with breakfast. In January of '89, Adam and his brother Harold Jr. made plans to meet up and grab breakfast at a local spot they enjoyed. Each brother drove there on their own, so when Harold Jr. arrived, he caught up with Adam and everything seemed to be normal. As the two brothers approached the restaurant, they noted a disheveled man standing outside. It was clear to both men that the man standing on the sidewalk was homeless, though neither approached nor had any kind of a conversation with him. As the two men were seated, they continued their conversation, but in the midst of talking, Adam politely excused himself from the table. Not thinking much of it, Harold sat back to wait for his brother's return from what he assumed was a visit to the restroom. But that is when he noticed what Adam was actually doing. Adam had gone outside and appeared to be having a conversation with the homeless man. After several minutes of watching, curiously intent on knowing what was going on, Harold viewed as Adam seemed to finish his conversation, turned, and came back into the restaurant sitting at the table. Confused but wondering, Harold asked Adam what that was all about, why he'd gone out to talk to the man, but Adam didn't really seem to have much of an answer. He just brushed it off. When Harold inquired as to what his brother had been discussing with the homeless man, Adam responded dismissively by saying nothing. Their conversation went back to where it had been, and by the time they'd finished their breakfast and were leaving, Harold didn't think too much about the incident. As the two brothers parted ways, Harold walked back to his car. As he turned to enter his car, he glanced towards the restaurant and was surprised to see that, rather than walking back to his car, Adam was once again standing in front of the store having a conversation with the homeless man. Adam had begun volunteering at the mission, so it was thought maybe he was just going to talk to the guy, tell him about the mission, or even offer the guy a few bucks and be on his way. The relationship between Adam and the homeless man was only just beginning, however. Over a short period of time, Adam began getting closer to the homeless man, who has henceforth been referred to as Tony. I do want to note, from what I could gather, Tony is not his real name. What his name is has never been revealed publicly. Regardless, Tony and Adam began spending a lot of time together. While his family was not immediately aware of it, Adam had begun spending more time on the streets, heading down into areas known to be populated by a large number of homeless individuals. It's thought that perhaps this began as an attempt to help. Adam was reported to have gone down into these areas on several occasions, bringing food along with him and handing it out to people. Within a few weeks of his first encounter with Tony, Adam made the choice to invite him to move into his apartment, which Tony accepted. With Tony now living with him, Adam began to bring Tony along with him to family gatherings. The family was taken aback by this. On the one hand, they understood that Adam wanted to help, but on the other, they thought that this might be taking things a little too far. Adam didn't really know Tony. He didn't know what he was capable of, and it's obviously a dangerous venture to invite someone into your home from off the streets, let alone begin bringing that person around your family for dinners and holidays. By all accounts I have read, Tony has been described as being an African-American male, large in stature, with either full or partial blindness in one of his eyes. There doesn't appear to be any reports of him doing anything out of the ordinary or causing any disturbances, but it's clear that Adam's family were growing concerned about the situation. Now with Tony as his companion, Adam began going back out onto the streets, but for longer durations. During this time, it wasn't all that out of the ordinary for Adam to leave his apartment, not returning until days later, spending his nights out on the streets. No one has ever been able to explain the process, though some have speculated that perhaps Adam had grown weary of his lavish and cultured life and wanted to branch out into other areas, to live amongst the homeless and experience the world from their point of view. In the spirit of complete disclosure, I've never found anything that can definitively explain the rationale or lack thereof behind Adam's behavior at this time. I've seen speculation all across the board, from the possibility of drug addiction to mental illness to being influenced and controlled by Tony. In fact, the angle of Tony possessing some kind of influence over Adam enters into the bizarre realm of mysticism. As if things weren't already strange enough, there have been a lot of mentions of Tony practicing some form or fashion of what has been called mysticism. I'm not exactly sure what's meant by that, and details are sparse, but one detail which can't be denied is that Adam was a willing participant in strange rituals alongside Tony. The Charlie Project, which has a short entry on Adam, says, quote, "Hecht became interested in meditation and mysticism under the influence of his new friend," end quote. The more Adam participated in these events, the more control it seemed that Tony was taking of him. In one incident, Adam sustained a severe burn on his right hand, which would eventually become a scar. This burn had something to do with a candle, and when Adam's mother asked him what had happened to cause the burn, his answer had something to do with it being an endurance test. It's always sounded to me as though Adam was made to hold his hand above an open flame and to endure the pain for as long as he could, which was apparently long enough to leave a scar. On one particular occasion, Adam visited his mother for dinner and brought Tony with him. Before eating, Adam's mother said that he began waving his hands over his food with what she could describe only as some kind of blessing. In her interview with Unsolved Mysteries, Adam's mother expressed a confluence of emotions about the situation, saying, quote, "Adam was very, very much wanting to talk about Tony. Adam seemed to understand Tony, and I was led to believe that Tony was really being very kind to Adam as far as helping him grow up as a person and mature. That's what he said to me. He's helping me mature as a person." End quote. Whatever belief that any of the family had about the positive work Adam was doing, or in what way Tony may have been contributing to Adam's self-growth, all of that would begin fading as the interactions with both Adam and Tony became more concerning. One interesting detail I saw on the NamUs page for Adam that I didn't see anywhere else read, quote, "At the time of his disappearance, he had been interested in meditation, especially in mountain areas," end quote. That's the first and only time I've seen any mention of Adam venturing out into the mountains beyond the city. By June of 1989, things had been going sideways for a while. The more time Adam spent with Tony, the more withdrawn he became with everyone else in his life. He continued sharing the apartment with Tony and also spending more time out on the streets amongst the homeless. Sometime during the first week of June, Adam brought his BMW down to the shop for some kind of repairs, though what specifically was wrong with the vehicle I've never been able to ascertain. Whatever the problem was, it was extensive enough that the shop would be hanging on to Adam's car for a while and he had to rent a car. Adam would never return for his BMW, and the rental car would eventually become the last clue in his strange and mysterious disappearance. Adam was last officially seen on June 7, 1989, leaving his apartment. From that day on, his apartment continued to be lived in by Tony, but Adam himself was nowhere to be found, nor was his car in the complex. After several days of trying to get in touch with Adam, his family was getting worried. Harold Jr. made the choice to go over to Adam's apartment to find out what was going on. He knocked on the door for several minutes before he got any response from inside, and it was from Tony. Harold asked Tony multiple times where Adam was, but Tony didn't seem to be able to answer or didn't want to. Either way, Harold stood at the door talking to Tony, trying to get information and to gain entry to the apartment, but he was denied. Tony would not allow Harold inside and didn't seem to be able to provide any insight as to where Adam may be. Unsure of what to do, Harold contacted members of the family and explained the situation. When Harold spoke to his mother and told her about the encounter with Tony and his inability to get inside, Martine made the decision that she was going down to Adam's apartment, and whether he wanted to or not, Tony was going to let her in. When she arrived, she knocked on the apartment door and it was answered by Tony. Martine managed to get inside the apartment and began going from room to room, calling out Adam's name and asking Tony where her son was. Reportedly, not only did she find no sign of Adam, but she felt by the appearance of the apartment that her son hadn't been there for several days. Finally, when she became angry, she confronted Tony more forcefully. At that time, Tony responded by behaving bizarrely and basically playing stupid, acting almost as if he didn't even know who Adam was. I should note here, in the Unsolved Mysteries episode, we see a very strange reenactment of the encounter between Martine and Tony. In their episode, Tony grabs Martine and asks for a kiss. When she asks him where her son is, Tony responds, "I'm your son." I don't know if that's partially dramatization or close to what actually happened. Usually, Unsolved Mysteries is pretty good with their reenactments, and I don't think they just throw that in there for no reason, but again, with this case having as little coverage as it does, I can't verify it. There's no interview with Martine where she gives the blow-by-blow of what took place in the apartment, but we know it was significantly disturbing and frightening enough to her that her response was to reach out to the Beverly Hills Police Department. The Hecht family officially reported Adam missing, but there was little information to provide to investigators. Of course, we should also remember this was 1989, and a missing 24-year-old man was unlikely to garner a great deal of concern from law enforcement that early on. Then again, the Hecht family was known in the area and may have had the ability to apply a little pressure to the Beverly Hills Police Department. But even today, when a 24-year-old goes missing, investigators aren't generally concerned from day one. That isn't necessarily to speak ill of these particular police, since you also have to factor in that in the months leading up to Adam's disappearance, it wasn't uncommon for him to be gone for several days at a time with no one knowing his whereabouts. He had just never been gone this long before. For the next few weeks, the Hecht family would wonder what could have happened to Adam. There were no calls, sightings, or any information where he could be. Flyers were produced, Adam's name was mentioned in papers and on local media, but for the most part, nobody seemed to know anything. If there was anyone who might possess information that could have led to Adam, it would have been Tony, but trying to get information out of him was extremely difficult. Some days, Tony seemed to be functioning on a good level and could discuss a topic and answer questions rationally. Other days, Tony didn't make much sense and seemed to be struggling with reality, and then there were the times where he was just flat out drunk or on something, which limited his abilities to have a meaningful conversation. Frustrated with the situation, the family requested that police go to Adam's apartment and force Tony to leave, as technically it wasn't his apartment, he wasn't paying for it, his name wasn't on the lease, so he had no legal right to be there. The Beverly Hills police arrived at the apartment and knocked on the door. When Tony opened it, they demanded to be allowed in, at which point Tony was told he had to vacate the premises. Apparently at this time, Tony argued a little bit, explaining that it was his friend's apartment and he was allowed to stay there, but police weren't having any of it. Tony was also questioned by police during this time about his connections to Adam and where he thought Adam might be, but Tony either didn't know or was able to convince investigators that he didn't know, and so he was let go and went back out onto the streets. Before Adam's case could ever really heat up, it was growing cold. Investigators hadn't found anything on Tony or in the apartment to suggest that foul play had been involved in Adam's disappearance. While we don't know the details of it, their conversation with Tony obviously didn't lead to any insights or revelations either. In fact, the Charlie Project reads, quote, "Police interviewed the man and decided he had nothing to do with Hecht's disappearance." End quote. At that point in time, there was little which could be done besides getting the word out about Adam and hoping that someone might recognize his photo or come forward with information. The first, and really last, clue in the case came approximately 1 month after Adam had been last seen. A vehicle matching the description of Adam's rental car had been sitting abandoned on a Beverly Hills side street long enough to have built up a collection of parking tickets. When the plate was run, it kicked back as belonging to Adam, and so investigators working his case were notified. I do want to make a note here. Every source I've found, including Unsolved Mysteries, says Adam's car was found 1 month after he went missing. However, the official listing on the Charlie Project says this happened 2 weeks after he disappeared. I can't verify for you which one is accurate, though part of me leans towards Charlie Project more than anything else. It may be that his car was found 2 weeks after he was officially reported missing, but 1 month after he had last been seen. Either way, upon arriving at the vehicle, investigators found the car to be in good shape, with no signs or indications of theft or any kind of a struggle or foul play. Whatever had led to the car being left in that location, authorities believed it had been Adam who left it there. Strangely, inside of the car, police found the keys still in the ignition. In addition to the keys, investigators retrieved Adam's jacket, as well as his wallet, which contained his driver's license, several $100s in cash, and all of his credit cards. While it made little sense to police, it seemed as though Adam had left these items behind. A thief or someone in the process of committing foul play would likely have at least taken the cash. Unfortunately, police were dealing with a situation where they had a missing person, but no evidence that any crime had actually been committed. While authorities believed that something must have occurred to have stopped Adam from returning, they had nothing, not even enough to consider the case criminal. Adam was 24, he could go wherever he wanted, and he didn't have to tell anyone. While that seemed highly unlikely given the circumstances, what else could be said about the situation? The Hecht family weren't ready to give up, hiring a private investigator as well as continuing their work with distributing flyers and reaching out to powerful and influential friends for assistance, but nothing seemed to be bringing them any closer to finding Adam. A few tips would come in, here and there, and police would follow up on the leads, but they never led to anything substantial. There were sightings, though none were ever confirmed. For a time, in recent years, online investigators found a professor named Adam Hecht, who they believed could be one and the same, but it was a different Adam Hecht altogether. It isn't uncommon to go to Reddit or any other forum that has a true crime section and find multiple posts about Adam's case. It's clearly a story that, 30 years later, draws in the curious. Sadly, there have been no major developments since Adam's vehicle was found in late June or early July of 1989. Adam's case is still considered open, but it doesn't seem as though much is being done with it. The tips have dried up, not that they were ever much of a help to begin with. Adam is listed on the websites for the Attorney General of California, the Doe Network, the Charlie Project, NamUs, and many others. To date, NamUs lists 22 unidentified victims whose remains have been unsuccessfully compared to Adam. At this time, I'm sure they are in possession of familial DNA, fingerprints, and at the time in 1989, they had Adam's dental records. If you'd like to examine Adam's listing on NamUs, you can find it under case number MP20906. When it comes to the disappearance of Adam Hecht, there are truly only two theories that most people discuss. The first theory presents the possibility that Adam, having entered a time of psychological confusion or emotional frustration, may have made the choice to walk away from his life, blending into the crowds of the homeless and becoming one of them. The second theory argues that Adam may have been the victim of foul play. Some believe foul play could have led to Adam's disappearance in the first place, while others believe it's possible that Adam went to spend a few nights out on the streets with the intention of returning, but was murdered by one of the very people he wanted to help. Adam Arthur Hecht was last seen on June 7, 1989 at his apartment in Beverly Hills, California. When last seen, Adam was described as being a Caucasian male, standing 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighing approximately 160 pounds. Adam has black hair and hazel eyes. There's a scar from a burn on Adam's right hand. Adam has been missing for 30 years, and if alive today, his 54th birthday would have been earlier this month. For the past 30 years, there has been no verified contact from Adam to any member of his family or anyone he may have known outside of his family. For the Hecht family, Adam's disappearance was devastating. A brother, friend, cousin, and son mysteriously vanishes into the streets with no explanation, no rhyme or reason to why. Tony never really left and has been spotted in the area over the past 30 years. Several members of the Hecht family have reported seeing Tony at various times, and the Beverly Hills Police Department say that they are well aware of Tony's whereabouts, but he has never at any time provided investigators with much of anything. Reportedly, at one point, he commented something along the lines of, "If you want to find him, then you need to look around the streets." The weeks leading up to Adam's disappearance continue to trouble those who knew him and wonder what became of him. While Adam's family remains devoted to loving him, After such a long time, they can't devote all of their energy to the search anymore. Every time a tip is called in, it's followed up on. Every time the family reaches out to investigators for the status of the case, they receive similar answers. Open, but not very active. At some point, you have to stop living in the past and move forward with your life for your own sanity. But you never forget, and the Hecht family certainly will never let go, nor accept that they'll never find the answers. However, 30 years later, finding a solid answer seems more like a hope than a probability. The disappearance of Adam Hecht is a case which has haunted me since I first learned about it on Unsolved Mysteries back in 1990. There's something so disturbing about how someone can just vanish in this way, especially in the process of trying to help people. What's truly bothersome about it to me is that Adam was a completely on-the-level guy. Everyone seemed to like him, and he was straight-laced and balanced. Then all of a sudden things start changing, and this guy who everyone has always known slowly starts transforming. And by the time you realize something isn't right, it's too late. Could you imagine a loved one going out there, trying to help, and then just disappearing without a trace? Before we get into the theories, I wanted to make note of something. If you look up Adam's case, you're not going to find much. At least you're not going to find much new information. Most of what's out there is the same stuff repeated over and over on various forums and blogs and wherever you're looking. I went into the newspaper archives and I couldn't find much about this case at all. I think at most one article had like 2 paragraphs about Adam. It's very frustrating when you're trying to cover a case, but you don't have anything to work with. So I did want to point out that one particular blog has a lot of information you're not going to find anywhere else. That blog is located at lostandfoundblogs.com and is by Crystal Dawn. She has a posting about Adam's case from February of this year, in which she covers the background as well as including information she gleaned by speaking with Adam's family and law enforcement. She has a lot of information available on that blog that you'll find interesting if you found this coverage interesting. She even discusses a possible suspect that I haven't seen mentioned anywhere else. I chose not to discuss that angle because I couldn't find anything about that person, but Crystal Dawn received this information directly from the family, so I absolutely recommend reading her blog if that intrigues you. I'll include a link to it in my show notes, as well as putting it on the website. Beginning with the first theory in this case, that Adam chose to walk away from his life and become one of the homeless, there are a couple of different angles here. One angle would focus on this being Adam's pure choice, without influence or manipulation. Another angle follows a theory promoted online by several people that Adam's connection to Tony may have revolved around drugs, and that during this time, Adam may have become an addict, answering to Tony's wishes in hopes of maintaining his drug connection. A third angle is that Adam may have been suffering from some kind of mental illness or other psychological issue which could have severely impaired his decision-making abilities, leading him to either walk off on his own or perhaps fall under the influence of Tony or some other individual. Starting from the bottom of those angles, we've got the possibility that Adam was suffering from some kind of mental illness or psychological issue that led to his strange behavior and ultimately his disappearance. In many instances, bipolar can manifest itself quickly, and if you're not spending a lot of time around a person, you may not notice the changes until it's too late. According to the Mayo Clinic, bipolar can manifest at any age but is typically discovered in the late teenage years or early 20s. Adam was 23 when his behaviors began changing. Not to be tied specifically to one possibility, we could also look at something like schizophrenia, in which symptoms begin showing up between the ages of 16 and 30, though the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation notes that symptoms typically show up earlier in men. So the onset of schizophrenia occurring at 23 for a male wouldn't be an outlier. Of course, no one in Adam's life reported him exhibiting any of these symptoms per se. From what we can tell, Adam wasn't hallucinating, having erratic speaking patterns, although he might fit into the depression and social withdrawal symptoms. Schizophrenia, though, is not as rare as you'd imagine. Your lifetime risk of becoming schizophrenic is 1 in 100. Not exactly astronomical odds. In Adam's case, you might be able to stretch the whole mysticism thing into being connected to hallucinations, but ultimately, I'm not a psychologist, so it's really not my place to try and diagnose, just suggest the possibility. So it's entirely possible that Adam was suffering from some kind of an episode, which resulted in his thoughts becoming unclear, and therefore the decision to move out onto the streets could have seemed almost logical. Memory can be impacted by a number of different psychological disorders, not to mention physical trauma. Someone could have tried to have robbed Adam, or merely gotten into a fight with him, and a hard knock to his head could have caused all sorts of issues, including but not limited to post-traumatic amnesia related to a traumatic brain injury, or even a dissociative fugue. It would seem that if this is what occurred, he'd have to have experienced some form or fashion of retrograde amnesia, though we couldn't rule out an injury extensive enough to have not only caused retrograde, but perhaps to have damaged his abilities to create new memories, causing anterograde amnesia. Of course, these results are not tied simply to physical trauma, but could be connected to anything which damages the hippocampus or other areas of the brain. A stroke, severe alcohol abuse, or even the use of illicit drugs, which takes us into the second angle of this theory, that Adam may have developed a severe drug addiction which led to his disappearance. This is a theory I've seen in a lot of different places. It makes sense. Young guy with a lot of disposable income, no wife or kids to support, no mortgage payments. It isn't difficult to imagine a young guy in the late 1980s finding himself facing a lot of different possibilities with drugs. Cocaine was big at the time. The crack epidemic, as it was called, reached its highest points between 84 and 90, so it isn't outside of the equation either. One thing about the drug angle, though, that's always bothered me, is people always tie it to Tony. What if Tony was supplying Adam, or Tony knew the guy Adam could get stuff from? Sure, that's possible, but you're telling me a rich guy in his 20s in 1989 couldn't find drugs through friends or an acquaintance? I find that a little difficult to believe, at least in terms of coke or weed or party drugs. Crack, on the other hand, might not be the drug of choice for rich Beverly Hills residents, although I guess you never know. So yeah, maybe that's something easier found on the streets, but I sincerely doubt Adam would need Tony to find crack, especially if he'd been spending time in seedy areas already. So yeah, drugs could play a role. Adam tries some things, ends up addicted, finds himself wandering the streets at night looking for a fix. Entirely possible, but there's another problem. If you're addicted to drugs, and your plan or your thought process basically revolves around getting your hands on more drugs, why are you going to leave hundreds of dollars worth of cash behind in your car? I guess it's possible he didn't want to carry that much cash on him, but he never came back for it, unless there was another reason why the car was left the way it was, which I'll get into in a moment. Staying on track with the drug possibility, we really can't deny it. It's entirely possible that Adam developed a problem and got in over his head. Obviously, finances wouldn't have been an issue, but is it all that difficult to imagine Adam could have been in the wrong place at the wrong time and with a not-so-great group of people if he truly was wandering the streets and hanging out with dealers and users? I guess that leans more towards the murder theory, so we'll get more into that after we address the final angle of this one. So the final angle of this first theory is that Adam made the choice of his own volition and walked away from his life. There's a couple of possibilities here. We know that in the weeks and months leading up to his disappearance, Adam was questioning a lot of things about his life and seemed to be veering off his path. While there isn't a great deal of information about it, the general gist seems to be that Adam was frustrated with the life he'd been living, looking at his rich upbringing more as a detriment than a benefit. I don't know how many of you know the story of Buddha, but it's interesting in how Adam's life parallels it to some degree. I'll keep this tangent short, I promise. In a nutshell, and pardon my huge paraphrasing here, in some scenarios, Buddha was born into a rich life and raised behind the walls of a palace where he had little if any knowledge of the world beyond those walls. Some beliefs say that Buddha once saw beyond those walls and witnessed a sick and dying man, and it was the first time he became aware of what the world was like for most people and that death was even a thing. And so he shed all of his attachments to his rich upbringing and went out into the world to find the true nature of the world itself and the true nature within himself. I am by no means trying to tie Adam's disappearance to the story of Buddha. It's not even something I practice, but I couldn't help but notice the similarities. So we've got Adam, who is now experiencing the darker side of the world. He's seeing people in pain. He's watching homeless folks try to survive, to make a place for themselves, to improve their world. He starts volunteering, and it's admirable. But somewhere along the line, things start to move too far. He brings Tony home, allows him to live with them, and yet keeps going out onto the streets at night and spending his time in the homeless communities. It's as if the more times he spends on the streets, the more he becomes someone who is a part of them. So, the most common belief here is that Adam went out on his own and chose to disappear, that he made the choice to leave his family and friends behind without any explanation or even a goodbye, to become a homeless person living on the streets in complete opposition to the life he once led. That's a possibility that can't be denied, especially when you look at the circumstances. I have difficulty accepting that Adam would walk out on his family without a goodbye, but it's happened in other cases. It just seems oddly out of place here. But there's nothing to indicate that Adam was forced to leave. No struggles, no forensic evidence to show a fight or any kind of resistance. When they find his car, it's parked neatly on the side of the road with his wallet, money, credit cards, license and jacket all inside, and the keys hanging from the ignition. Not exactly what you'd expect to find had he been attacked, robbed, or forced to go. Of course, I've always wondered, what if Adam always did this? We know he spent a decent amount of his nights out on the streets, amongst the homeless. While there are many good people who find themselves homeless due to uncontrollable circumstances, there are also those who are homeless due to mental illness or criminal activities. You're certainly not safe spending your nights on the street with homeless people that you don't know. Adam was not a stupid man, so wouldn't it make sense that if he was planning to spend his nights out on the street, he might leave his valuables behind in his car to protect himself from being robbed? To me, it would make sense if each time Adam went onto the streets, he left things behind in this way so that when he was ready to go home, he had all of his stuff. The keys in the ignition is the only detail that really bothers me in regard to this possibility. Why not leave them in the glove box or under the seat if you were really planning to come back? Leaving them hanging from the ignition seems like a risky proposition, but then again, it's Beverly Hills in 1989, not exactly an overabundance of crime happening there. So what if Adam left these items behind as part of his routine, but on this particular night, something stopped him from getting back? That leads us into the second theory, that Adam was the victim of foul play. There's a couple of different ways you could look at the homicide possibility. Some people believe that Tony could have murdered Adam or been involved in his murder in some attempt to maintain access or control of his apartment, or that they got into an argument over money or something of that nature. I've even seen suggestions of a possibility that there could have been a relationship between Adam and Tony, though I've got no evidence to back that up. Others think that Adam fell victim to someone on the streets, and what became of him is unknown. Tony has always been one of the creepiest aspects of this case. And I fully admit that for me at least, that's partially due to how he was represented on Unsolved Mysteries. The actor in that reenactment was so damn creepy it's always stuck with me. If the real Tony were like that or worse, I don't blame anyone for feeling uneasy about what he could have done. With Tony, it's hard to specify anything. We don't know if he's got some kind of psychological disorder, if he's violent, if his bizarre behavior is due to mental illness, drug use, alcohol, or even some kind of physical trauma to the brain. What we do know, however, is that for the past 30 years, while Tony has been run in on random charges such as loitering and is known to the police in the area, the guy's never been charged with any kind of crime related to murder. You'd imagine if he was out of it enough to murder someone like Adam, who was offering to help and give him money, he'd probably have murdered someone else by now, or at least been in a seriously violent altercation, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. We have to keep in mind that the police spoke to Tony. They didn't feel he was responsible for Adam's disappearance. I'd feel more comfortable agreeing with them on that had I actually seen a transcript of the interview, but the police have kept an eye on Tony for the past 30 years, so there may have at least been something that made them believe keeping track of him was a good idea. Then again, maybe they just thought he could lead them to Adam at some point in time. The family has said that Tony wasn't very helpful and that he didn't really give straight answers. However, it's important to note that in addition to the police, much of Adam's family doesn't believe Tony did anything to him either. For me, when the family looks at someone such as Tony, who was close to Adam and certainly behaves in a bizarre fashion, and says they don't think he's guilty of the crime, they probably know more about the situation than the public does, and I'm inclined to trust their judgment. I'm not saying Tony couldn't have done something, just that there's never been any evidence that he did. So to me, that leaves one last possibility. Earlier, I talked about Adam leaving his valuables behind in his car. He knew the streets were dangerous, and he knew that no matter how kind or giving he may be, if the opportunity arose to get more from him, whether he wanted to give it or not, there are people who are going to take that opportunity. Leaving his stuff in the car, to me at least, translates one of two possible messages. Either Adam is saying, "Goodbye, I'm leaving everything that connected me to my past life," or Adam did this all the time to protect himself. Well, what if on this occasion, someone wanted to rob him, and when they found out he didn't have anything on him, they weren't too pleased? I mean, let's face it, I highly doubt Adam was walking around in torn, unwashed clothes. He probably stuck out a bit amongst the crowd. The question becomes, if that is what happened, well, what became of Adam? If he was murdered in, say, a robbery gone wrong or a fight, what did they do with him? It's kind of hard to dispose of a body in Beverly Hills or Los Angeles in a way where it's never going to be found. I suppose there could have been a burial site, places that cops don't check because it's mostly just homeless people down there, but there's also the chance that he was found and thought to just be a homeless person, and so he was buried in a pauper's grave. While they've obviously compared a lot of does to Adam's record, we don't know for certain that they've compared them all, especially tracking back to '89. NamUs does list the first doe compared to Adam's records as having been found on August 31st, 1989. Inside of the first year of his disappearance, 4 does were ruled out. Interestingly, of the 22 comparisons made, 3 were done involving bodies found in California. 19 were done with bodies in Virginia. I don't know if that's just a result of the bodies in Virginia resembling Adam, or if there's something to indicate he could have traveled to Virginia. Murder can't be ruled out. It's entirely possible that Adam went out one particular night, fully planning to come home the next day or a few days later, and something just went seriously wrong. Remember, you're not just dealing with homeless folks who are kind and caring. There are troubled people out there who could hurt you. Adam seemed to be very nice, giving, and compassionate. It's not hard to imagine someone taking advantage of his nature or manipulating it to their own ends. Maybe Adam woke up one day and realized that was what was happening, and when he tried to get out, it was too late. The fact of the matter is, we don't have enough information to say one way or the other, but we certainly can't say that murder is not a possibility, especially considering that Adam Hecht has not been seen for more than 30 years. Unless Adam shows up somewhere, someone provides new information, someone comes forward and confesses, or Adam himself is found, the disappearance of Adam Hecht remains open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Adam Hecht, there are a few websites out there that have information and very few news articles. I highly recommend going to official sites like NamUs and the Charlie Project, or checking out Crystal Dawn's blog at lostandfoundblog.com, which again I will link to in the show notes. If you have any information about the disappearance of Adam Hecht, please contact the Beverly Hills Police Department at area code 310-285-2184. Case number 890-4930. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, Instagram message me at TraceEvidencePod, or comment in the Facebook group. I wanted to take this opportunity at the end of the show here to address a couple of things before I do the closing. Firstly, I've provided transcripts of the episodes on this show on our website because I have listeners who like to read along as well as hearing impaired true crime fans. Unfortunately, I have to pull them all down now due to recent developments in the news that you may or may not have heard of, but basically people really enjoy using my scripts as the basis for their own, but it's too difficult for them to actually cite me as a source. I'm going to try to figure out a system where you can request transcripts via email, but I simply can't make them publicly available anymore due to the actions of those who should know better. For those of you interested in learning more about that situation, I appeared on Let's Taco About True Crime, hosted by Esther Ludlow from Once Upon a Crime. Together, alongside Robin Warder from The Trail Went Cold, the three of us discussed these recent developments in an episode that should be available within the next day or so. I'll share it on social media when it drops, but it goes into extensive detail, although I discovered new developments today that I wasn't aware of at the time of the recording in relation to a situation with a completely different podcast. In what I believe is good news, I've been looking at trace evidence and have been planning some changes. When I first launched the show, it was supposed to be all unsolved crimes, but all I've ever done are murders and disappearances. I was thinking of expanding the show to include other unsolved crimes. Bank robberies, art thefts, that kind of thing. It wouldn't become the norm, but I thought it would be interesting to sprinkle some of those in every once in a while, but I'd love to hear what you think about that. Finally, as some of you are aware, on Patreon I will begin posting one episode per month that is not available in the normal feed beginning in September. In these episodes, I'll discuss a variety of cases, including solved cases which are voted on monthly by patrons. These episodes will also be available through the Himalaya podcast app for those who become premium members. But speaking of Patreon, special shout out to Patreon producers Emily Smith, Megan Cotter, Kate Alexander, Chandra Moreau, Jacob Williams, Brian Kemmerling, Wannabe Sleuth 2, Laura Dixon, Julia Rexon, Diane Dyson, Jessica, Tom Archer, Eamon Brady, Tara Doble, Alicia Lorraine, Krista Colvin, Randy Weiland, and Megan. You are all absolutely amazing. I'm going to leave you with a promo for a podcast called Bad in the Boondocks. It's a true crime podcast that takes you into crimes that occur maybe in the areas that are a little less traveled, but I'm sure they have their own way to tell you about it. And why wouldn't you help out a fellow true crime podcast if you have the ability? So I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.
Hey, I'm Stan.
And I'm Drew, and we are your hosts of Bad in the Boondocks.
Bad in the Boondocks is a fresh take on true crime podcast.
We are a father and son team from way back in the sticks of South Carolina.
Yeah, in a town of less than 500, and we have a shared passion for all things true crime. So, every Saturday we get together and swap stories about a true crime event.
We try and find the most twisted and vile losers of our human race. Now, you won't hear a lot of endless banter on Bad in the Boondocks.
But what you will hear is all the unedited facts on the cases we choose, no matter how gory or troublesome they are. And you'll hear it all with a unique southern flair.
And along the way, you'll hear just the right amount of discussion and jokes to keep you and us from completely losing your mind. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms like iTunes, Google, Stitcher, Himalaya, and CastBox, or just go to badintheboondocks.com and download all of our episodes there.
So, come on down to the Boondocks and get your redneck on with us. We promise you'll have a good time.